the great fakery which affects people when you mention the word economics is money. They try to explain a system of money which is a sound system, they argue, for running an economy. And as I said, a system of money is insane, intrinsically, because it's only paper, it's arbitrary, it has no physical content. Did you ever see money plow a field? Did you ever see a coin talking? If you did, you should talk to about that. All right, so therefore, money has no intrinsic value, nor does gold have an intrinsic value as a currency. These things have determined values by the processes in which they function. Money is merely a medium of exchange. It is necessary because society is composed of tightly integrated and complex social relations. And therefore, in order to process the exchange of goods and other things, you need money as a measure of the social political process of exchange. Money properly is created only by a government, not by anybody else. One of the great evils we have to contend with is money being created by private interests who then sell money on the market for a price, such as central banking systems or private family-style merchant banks, which create currency and demand a monopoly among themselves, among the bankers, of a control over a currency. This is where the problem arises. Because then when this group gets control over the value of money, the power to determine its value by interest rates, yields, and so forth, then man becomes a victim of paper. And evil takes over. So the important thing is, how should we define the production of a necessary medium of exchange called money, or credit issued against money, or charge against the delivery of money? How should we measure that, and how should we control that? Well, obviously it has to be done by a sovereign government. Why? Because the process of production and distribution depends upon a relationship between the income of the individual or firm or entity which consumes and those who produce. In general, the objective is that the cost of production should be less than the price of the goods sold. But that's on the average. The root of this thing is very simple. The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals, including Arnold Schwarzenegger. There is no proper economy. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families in which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them. Discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production. And therefore, essentially, economy starts with purely physical values in the sense of the physical values dependent upon man's ability to discover universal physical principles and to derive and apply technologies obtained through these discoveries. That is real economics. Now, this economics has two essential features. One, which we already discussed in the process of the conference repeatedly. On the one side, we have what we call universal physical principles per se. These are discoveries of principles which an individual mind makes. Maybe many individual minds make them, but they each make them individually. You don't learn, you don't have a creative process in which somebody makes a discovery and then gets out and describes the discovery to others, and that is not actually transmitting the discovery. That is, the people who receive this instruction, this learning, do not really know what they're talking about. Only the person who creates the idea or who recreates the discovery of the idea actually knows what he or she is talking about. Only he or she is qualified to understand how to apply what is described to those who merely learn. And therefore, it is the participation of people in reenacting discoveries from the past and applying them socially which is the source of the increase of wealth. And therefore, without that process, which includes the process of education, maturation, family relations, and so forth, classical artistic forms of productions, all these things go together to enable human beings to make discoveries of principle, to reenact those discoveries, to apply those principles to practice, and to know how to use tools which are relevant to these kinds of discoveries. And that's how wealth is produced, essentially, from the standpoint of the individual.
Okay, if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Town Meeting broadcast of the LaRouche organization. And this is Saturday, April 1st. And in honor of April Fool's Day, we began with that discussion by Lyndon LaRouche from 2003 of why money is an idiot. That is, money that cannot talk, speak. It does not create anything. It's paper. And you don't want to have people's mental processes dominated by paper. It's human beings that matter, not money that matters. And it's an important way to start just from the standpoint of trying to wrap our minds around what's presently happening in today's United States and also in the transatlantic system as a whole, in which we have a process in which the drive of debt and the drive of a certain kind of war machine to pay debt has compromised the safety and health of the entire planet. So much so that in recent statements of the past 24 hours, coming from, for example, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, he has emphasized again that the world stands on the verge of total thermonuclear war unless measures are taken to scale back the headlong confrontation into thermonuclear destruction that presently is being generated by NATO in the theater at Ukraine. Now, it's necessary for us to intervene in this process. One of the last things that you heard Mr. LaRouche say, if you just joined us, is that if you have someone who has made a fundamental discovery and they go out and try to describe it to other people, the other people can't really understand what it is. They have to reenact that discovery. And while that might seem to only apply to economics, it actually applies to everything. And in our world today, when we are looking at the problem that people feel paralyzed by what they think is a headlong process outside of their control, which is taking them in a direction of doom. Those of us who are in the LaRouche organization, or those of us in the peace movement, otherwise, or in other organizations, have discovered something else or know something else, which is it's possible for individual citizens anywhere in the world, actually, but particularly in the United States or in the countries of Europe, which are the offending nations in this particular case of the provocation of war. It's necessary for us to stand up against that process. Now, people believe that they are powerless, but that's not true. That's not so. And it's important that the people who think they're powerless demonstrate the actual power of citizens speaking truth to power, as it's sometimes said. We're going to show you here first a confrontation or a discussion, I will call it that, between Ray McGovern and former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld.
Colin front with the American Center for International Studies, and of course within the speech came a few protesters.
And so I would like to ask you to be upfront with the American people. Why did you lie to get us into a war that was not necessary and that has caused these kinds of casualties? Why?
Well, first of all, I haven't lied. I did not lie then. Colin Powell didn't lie. He spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence Agency people and prepared a presentation that I know he believed was accurate. And he presented that to the United Nations. The president spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence people. And he went to the American people and made a presentation. I'm not in the intelligence business. They gave the world their honest opinion. It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction there.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not. I said I knew where suspect sites were, and we were just...
You said you knew where they were, near Tikrit, near Baghdad, and north, east, south, and west of there. Those are your words.
My words were that... No, wait a minute. Let him stay 1 second. Just a second.
This is America, huh?
You're getting plenty of play, sir.
I just like an honest answer.
I'm giving it to you.
We're talking about lies, and your allegation that there was bulletproof evidence of ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Was that a lie, or were you misled?
Zarqawi was in Baghdad during the pre-war period. That is a fact.
Zarqawi? He was in the north of Iraq in a place where Saddam Hussein had no rule. That's where he was.
He was also in Baghdad.
Yeah, when he needed to go to the hospital. Come on, these people aren't idiots. They know the story.
You are... Let me give you an example. It's easy for you to make a charge, but why do you think that the men and women in uniform, every day when they came out of Kuwait and went into Iraq, put on chemical weapon protective suits? Because they liked the style? They honestly believed that there were chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on his own people previously. He'd used them on his neighbor, the Iranians, and they believed he had those weapons. We believed he had those weapons.
That's what we call a non sequitur. It doesn't matter what the troops believe. It matters what you believe.
I think, Mr. Secretary, the debate is over. We have other questions. Okay. Courtesy to the audience.
I guess over here.
Good grief.
It's a hard act to follow.
You've forgotten your question.
That was Ray McGovern, who was a CIA analyst for 27 years, founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And he was practicing there what is called the art of intervention. And I believe Ray's with us right now. And we'd like to have Ray make a comment, first of all, on that occasion and what he did there, but also just about now and what was needed now, what the American citizens need to do. So, Ray, thanks for being with us. I know the circumstances are not ideal, but please go right ahead and make whatever comments you'd like to make.
Thanks, Janice. There are a lot of teaching points that apply to what happened there on May the 4th, 2006. Rumsfeld was not used to being confronted that way. And no one knew that he was going to be speaking at this well-heeled, all-white, defense-related, wealthy think tank in Atlanta, Georgia. No one knew that except some really enterprising women from World Can't Wait at the time, okay? They called me up and they said, Rumsfeld's going to be here at the same time you're here to get that ACLU award, Ray. Would you like to be there when Rumsfeld speaks? And I said, You bet I would, but how do I get in? Their website doesn't say anything about this speech. They said, leave it to us. It's going to cost $70. We have the money. If you don't, we'll get you a ticket. They got me a ticket. That night I was speaking at the ACLU. They got me a ticket, and it was a really amazing performance. There I was among all this Southern gentry, and a couple of troops lined up to applaud every time Rumsfeld gave them a little hint. And I had done my homework. I was preparing my speech for that night, actually, and some of this came right out of that speech. I knew my facts, and I kind of saw the ambiance as well. In other words, I knew I wouldn't be very popular. And so I was more confrontational than I otherwise would be because I didn't want to be shut down. I almost was, but miracle of miracles, CNN, Atlanta, C-SPAN, they were carrying it live. Besides that, it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So there was competition afoot here. MSNBC, CBS, all the cable channel. Well, it was going to be on CNN. This was sort of a big deal, somebody confronting Rumsfeld with his own lies, and so it played big that evening. Now, here's a little teaching point. As I was leaving, usually it was a fire trap, there were all big lines to get out the exit. And I turned around behind me, and I thought I'd see at least one sympathetic soul that would go, way to go. But all I got was people put their heads down. Then I got a call, all right? Got a call. Mr. McGovern, this is Anderson Cooper. You're causing quite a stir down here in Atlanta. I'd like to have you on my program tonight, but first I have to ask you a question. I said, well, go ahead, Anderson. He says, well, how do I say this? Weren't you afraid? Now, I was pretty much in shock myself, and so I said, well, that's a normal question. I said, well, no, I wasn't. And then I thought, wait a second. This is the Vanderbilt fortune. He's not going to be out on the street with his hat out if he loses his job at CNN. And so I said, Anderson, let me be really frank with you, okay? He said, oh, sure. I said, well, I had done work, and I knew he had lied to his teeth. And, it was a big deal for me. It was great to be able to catch these guys. You might want to try that sometime, Anderson. Try to do your homework. The real question, it's a big hi. And he says, oh, well, very well, Mr. McGovern. I'll have my folks get in touch with your folks.
I think we've lost Ray's connection. Is that the case? We'll try to get him back on. Okay. Is that I believe that's the case. Is that if that is the case, let's decide. Okay, well, you're going to try to get him back on. Can I hear something here so I just know what we're going to do? All right. Well, I'll assume that we are going to be reconnecting with Ray. And as we are doing that, he's obviously in the middle of the story about Donald Rumsfeld, but it's of relevance because another element of that story, not from that time when Ray intervened, but from the period of 2011, where we had another case of confrontation with Donald Rumsfeld, not actually of one of our people, but someone who was having a discussion with Donald Rumsfeld in which the name Lyndon LaRouche came up. This involved the 2011 interview which Rumsfeld was giving. And the interviewer brought up that during Rumsfeld's visit to Moscow, he had had the occasion to have a conversation with a Soviet military official who brought up to Mr. Rumsfeld that it was Lyndon LaRouche who was the author an originator of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And what happened was that Rumsfeld simply denied that, saying that the official must have gotten his information from the internet. And in the 2011 interview in which this came up, he further talked about his great surprise that someone of the stature of in that case, this was the former chief of staff of the Russian armed forces, would be so badly informed that he would believe that someone like Lyndon LaRouche could have possibly had anything to do with the defense establishment. So Rumsfeld's ability to lie, to misrepresent, to prevaricate, as some people like to call it, is well known. And on these questions of particularly war, his own relationship, for example, to Saddam Hussein and the provision of chemical weapons to Iraq in the 1980s, which is one of the reasons that he might have been so sure that the weapons were there. These matters have yet to be ever reviewed by the American people. And at this time that we are talking about things like the International Criminal Court trying to bring Vladimir Putin, quote, to justice, no one at the International Criminal Court has yet offered to bring Donald Rumsfeld. Well, Donald Rumsfeld, of course, is deceased, but the people of that period of the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney being the two still extant perpetrators of that. Nobody talks about bringing them to justice for crimes committed against humanity, but they should. And we want to be involved we're involved in a process which will, in 2 weeks, in particular, be on display at the Schiller Institute conference, which will be happening on April 15th, which is that there can be no real peace without security for all nations. Now, that's going to be a 2-day conference. We'll be starting on the morning, 9 a.m. Saturday morning, April 15th. It consists of 4 panels, and it will be an international conference online. We want to have thousands of people come. One of the ideas of today's discussion is that prior to that, over the next 2 weeks, and as the drive for war continues to escalate, or the expansion of war actually escalates, the danger of war escalates, particularly in the context of this collapse, financial collapse that's going on. We want to make sure that what is done by the American people, what is done by people otherwise, is to take the opportunity to actually deploy for the purpose of having their voices heard. I think we may have Ray back, and if we don't have Ray yet, let me know. Or do we have Harley Schlanger? Okay, is Harley there? You are there?
Yep,
okay.
I'm here.
Okay, I think what we better do is, since they're having the problems they're having with Ray's connection, Harley, why don't we go to you until they can figure out how to secure that?
Okay. I'm going to be discussing the so-called Summit for Democracy, which has nothing to do with democracy. It's an Anglo-American operation, which is a defense of the unipolar order. And the idea is to organize a coalition of so-called democratic nations to oppose authoritarian states through support of the rule of law, the rules-based order, freedom of speech and press, free trade and free enterprise, and so on. Let me just begin with a couple of examples of why this is nothing but hypocrisy. Take freedom of the press, for example. Blinken yesterday commented on the Russian arrest of a Wall Street Journal reporter for espionage. Now, so far, there's no report of the evidence. Blinken didn't have a report of the evidence, but he said this is an absolute disgrace, and this is why we need such things as the Summit for Democracy. Were you worried about freedom of the press, Mr. Blinken? What about the U.S. prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange? What about the reports that show that the US government agencies were involved in the phony Russiagate attack on both Trump and Putin for a number of years? What about the Twitter files, which show that US government agencies were involved in censoring or organizing Twitter to censor individuals? As to the rule of law, this has been replaced by something called the responsibility to protect. And I'll get to that in a couple of moments, the Tony Blair role in putting an end to the Westphalian order. But rule of law, well, what about the bombing of Yugoslavia? Was that the rule of law? What about the invasion of Iraq, which you just heard from Ray's intervention on Rumsfeld, was based on lies? Lies that they knew were lies, despite what Rumsfeld said. Rumsfeld was just lying again when he said that Colin Powell was convinced of the evidence. In fact, Colin Powell later said he knew it was false. What about the bombing and regime change in Libya? What about the regime change operations in Syria, in which the U.S. was involved in defending and organizing al-Qaeda through the CIA, and we're still in Syria illegally, controlling a whole section of the country where there's oil? What about the regime change in Ukraine? Is that the rule of law? Now, then we have the idea of why you need this summit so that there can be a building of trust. What about the lies that from the US in particular, but the West in general, to the Russians at the end of the Cold War of no eastward expansion of NATO? What about the lies in the Minsk Accord? As for cooperation and development and trust and anti-corruption, how about stealing $9 billion from Afghanistan that was deposited in US banks, or $300 billion from Russia? How about sanctions, which kill? So, you look at these things and you say, who are these people who are talking about the great democratic West standing up for people's freedom worldwide? Now, I'm going to give you a background of where this Summit for Democracy comes from, as they're attempting to establish new further rules for intervention by an imperial force backed by NATO and US military and the power of the City of London and Wall Street financially, which, by the way, they're losing that power. But the story actually goes back to February 22nd, 1946, and the figure of George Kennan sending what was called the long telegram from the US Embassy in Moscow to Washington. And he was asked about what could we make of the Soviet actions, the refusal to join the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which the Soviets did refuse to do, even though they did join the United Nations. And what Kennan basically wrote was that you can't trust the Russians, and he advocated what was called the containment doctrine. That is, you had to have a Western agreement to contain the danger of an expansion of communism through the military of the Soviet Union. Now, 2 weeks later, on March 5th, 1946, was the famous Churchill speech, Winston Churchill, invited to speak at Fulton, Missouri by Harry Truman, who was then the president. And what he said in that speech was he introduced the modern version of the idea of the Iron Curtain. He said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Now, Churchill coined another phrase in that speech, the idea of the special relationship and the necessity of an American-British alliance to defend freedom internationally. Now, shortly after this, you had a move by the U.S. Secretary of State, George Marshall, at the urging of Harry Truman, to create an agency in the State Department for advanced planning. And this became known as the Policy Planning Office of the U.S. State Department. And it's been described as a principal strategic arm of the State Department. The man tasked with founding it and running it was none other than George Kennan, the author of the Containment Doctrine. And his first assignment was to design what became known as the Marshall Plan, which was introduced in 1948. And Kennan was one of the major creators of this. Now, most people think of the Marshall Plan as an act of beneficence by the United States to rebuild, especially Germany, after the war. Well, there were funds that went to that, and funds that went to some element of rebuilding. What worked in Germany was the policy of Adenauer in creating the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, using that agency to invest in infrastructure. But actually, the idea of the Marshall Plan was to rebuild Europe, remove trade barriers, and prevent the spread of communism, that is, to contain Russia. And the total funding was $13.3 billion, which in today's terms might be about 160, 170 billion. But the largest recipient was not Germany. The largest recipient of the funds was the United Kingdom. 26% of the Marshall Plan funding went to Britain, 18% to France, and Germany got 11% of that. Now, this policy planning office became a permanent office in the State Department. After George Kennan, the next director was a well-known Atlanticist, Paul Nitze, who was a financier who was for many years with Dillon Read as a firm. Other directors have included Dennis Ross, who's known for his involvement in the West Asia area, Paul Wolfowitz, the sidekick of Rumsfeld and Cheney in drafting the unipolar order idea, Richard Haas, who became and is now president and CEO of or director of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Jake Sullivan was a director of the Policy Planning Office, the current National Security Advisor to Biden. Another prominent figure associated with this office for years was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, it was in this office in 2008 that the idea was introduced of a democratic alliance, what became later known as the D10 Project, the Democratic 10. It was 2008 in the State Department, and it later migrated over to the Atlantic Council, where they picked it up in 2014. But let me just point out that the other part of the operation, besides the Atlantic Council, was the German Marshall Fund, which was set up in 1972 to focus on democratizing civil society in Europe. They have programs including the Balkan Trust for Democracy. Think again about what happened in Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. The Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation. The Fund for Belarus Democracy. This was an agency that was designed to fund so-called democratic resistance to the existing so-called authoritarian states. It was created in 1972, the Marshall Fund. Willy Brandt was one of the movers of it. And one of the early grants to create it came from the Institute for International Economy, which is a leading neoliberal think tank to this day. Now, they also worked very closely with the Chicago Council of World Affairs, and they did surveys called the Transatlantic Trends. They set up a Transatlantic Fellowship Program and a Transatlantic Academy to train people to act in civil society in countries that were not part of the West, mainly Eastern Europe and so on. Now, why is this important? Well, in April 1999, the Blair Doctrine was announced at the Chicago Council of World Affairs. Tony Blair, at that time, opened his speech by talking about the situation in Kosovo and the need for Western intervention, which later became a NATO bombing operation, supposedly to protect the people of Kosovo. Blair spoke of the responsibility to protect, which then became the code word for military intervention. And Blair specifically addressed overturning the principle of Westphalia, which included non-intervention in the internal affairs of other nations. Now, from this background, let's look at where the Summit for Democracy comes from. I mentioned in 2008 the idea was kicked around within the State Department Policy Committee. Then people from that agency, along with the German Marshall Fund, went to the Atlantic Council and set up what they called the Democracy 10 or the D10 Committee. Now, the roster of countries that are the Democratic 10 reads like the global NATO today. It includes Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, and of course the US and the UK, and they threw in the European Union as well. These nations were chosen according to the Atlantic Council documents because these are the nations that possess the diplomatic, economic, and military resources to act on a global scale. The D10 itself was founded as a project within the Atlantic Council in 2014, shortly after the Maidan coup in Ukraine. And their first session was in July 2014. And they talked about the mission of protecting democracy from authoritarians. Now, this was further defined in March 2017, where they had a summit titled Strategy of Constrainment. So it's a play on the words containment from Kennan. But they defined this as an initiative, quote, to counter Russia's challenge to the rules-based democratic order, unquote. Now, when you get to the Summit for Democracy in 2021, which was largely what they're now calling an inconsequential talk shop of sloganeering and attempts to congratulate everyone for the freedom of their countries, that is, the participants. The conference in 2023 was greeted with a special report from the Atlantic Council. It's titled Fostering a Fourth Democratic Wave, a Playbook for Countering the Authoritarian Threat. There were 3 people who were largely responsible for drafting this. All came from the State Department policy planning staff, also through the German Marshall Fund, and then to the Atlantic Council. The report opens by saying that there is a powerful autocratic wave sweeping the globe, which somewhat contrasts with Biden's description of the conference as turning the democratic tide in favor of democracy. But what they say is they have to contend with autocrats who, quote, clamp down on their civil societies, coordinate strategies, propagate authoritarian governance abroad, and engage in increasingly sharp attacks against democracies, unquote. They said that the measures that they're introducing include 1, strengthening democratic resilience, exerting top-down and bottom-up pressure on autocratic regime, and fostering coordination by a range of actors. How are they going to do this? 1, develop new approaches and tools to support civil resistance efforts, similar to Victoria Nuland handing out cookies at Maidan Square after handing out $5 billion to fund the coup in Ukraine in 2014. Secondly, advancing a new international norm, which they call the right to assist pro-democracy movements. So it goes beyond responsibility to protect to the right to assist. In other words, to do everything possible to conduct regime change. And finally, point number 3, to develop strategic and tactical options to constrain authoritarian regimes and drive up the cost of their repression. Well, that obviously includes punitive sanctions, war, assassination, and so on. Now, this playbook, as it's called, was the main topic of discussion at the Summit for Democracy. As you can see, as I said at the beginning, this is a strategy for conducting regime change against governments which refuse to submit to the version of the rules-based order, which is cooked up by the Anglo-Americans. Blinken has toured the world talking about the rules-based order. This has nothing to do with international law. As I listed what the US has been involved in and NATO's been involved in the beginning, in overthrowing governments, imposing sanctions, stealing funds necessary to keep populations alive, that's not international law. That's the imposition of an arbitrary set of rules enforced ultimately by control of credit from institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and private banks and secondly, through use of NATO and US military. That's what the rules-based order is, and that's what the Summit for Democracy was all about. And that's why it's absolutely essential that the story of what's behind this get out, that people know something about or learn something about this policy planning staff that comes from the State Department, and how this fits in with the whole history of the Cold War order from 1945, from the death of Franklin Roosevelt until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then the new post-Cold War order that includes this constant intervention in the internal affairs of other nations, which is a violation not just of the Westphalian Principle, but of the UN Charter. So that's just a brief summary of why this Summit for Democracy is a complete fraud. And let me just finish by saying that around the world, most governments in the so-called Global South, which Sergei Lavrov is now referring to as the global majority, most people in those governments recognize this as a farce. They're laughing at the pretensions of people like Blinken and Biden, Sunak, the Western leaders who come before them to talk about how important it is that we teach the whole world about our democratic ways. That so-called global coalition of Biden is betting everything right now on being able to win the war in Ukraine against Russia, which is not going to happen. And secondly, preparing for a second front war against China. That's what the Summit for Democracy is all about.
Just joined us. We want to welcome you all to our program today, The Art of Intervention. We had an earlier technical problem with Ray McGovern. I believe he's back. Before we go to Ray, let me also indicate we are taking questions. We'll scroll that on the bottom of the screen. And we want to make sure people know about our conference, which is going to be in 2 weeks from today. It's a Schiller Institute conference, actually, called Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace for the Planet. Citizens of the World Unite. And you can register there. I actually want to get people to pre-register and to organize for the conference. In fact, one of the whole points of the theme of what we wanted to discuss today is this idea of intervention and intervening, meaning that you actually go and place in not harm's way, but in the way of controversy, on behalf of the work that has to be done to change exactly this process of dictatorship that was just being described by Harley. So if we can go back to the phone there, do we have Ray? Is he there?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, yeah, we can hear you, Ray. Good. So yes, you were sorely missed, but you are back. So if you can pick up where you left off.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I was talking about the bizarre call I got from Anderson Cooper, the darling of CNN, and that he asked me, wasn't I afraid? And after I thought about it, I said, well, Anderson, ask some real questions and you'll find it's a real high. You don't have to be afraid. That's part of the deal of being a journalist. You're not supposed to be afraid. And lastly, when I was invited onto his show, the first question he asked me, I mean, isn't this amazing? First question he asked me on air was, Mr. McGovern, weren't you afraid? I mean, like, it's okay to be afraid. Why would anybody challenge it? You know. So anyhow, there was a lot of this stuff that night. Paula Zahn, I don't know if you remember her. She came with CBS. I don't know. She comes on and she says, Mr. McGovern, come on. How long have you had this animus toward Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld? I said, animus? I know what that means. Did whoever wrote that for you? Do you know what that means? Yeah, you hate him. I don't hate. I hate his lies, you know. And besides, I didn't follow him down to Atlanta like you just said. He followed me down. Actually, I was here first. So you got to expect this kind of harassment from the mainstream press, even though it was clearly obvious that Rumsfeld had lied, that he tried to defend it, but he couldn't go back on his own words. What else from that? Oh, yeah, you have to be in touch with people. I mean, had I not been in touch with the World Can't Wait people in New York and Washington and in Atlanta, I never would have known about Rumsfeld. It wasn't advertised for obvious reasons. They didn't want the likes of me in there to ask a Q during the Q&A. So stay involved. Make sure you know about these. Make sure that people you know who know what you might want to do tell you about these things. And then, of course, be prepared. I was preparing my own speech for that night at the ACLU. It was the Citizenship Award won the previous year by Coretta Scott King. So I had to do my homework on that. Luckily, some of that factual stuff that I was including in my speech, I could use against Rumsfeld. Now, the other thing is that sometimes you forget, at least I forget, and what I hope that you will do is never forget this. Always have an iPhone with you by somebody else. Always have a videographer. Always put it on tape. Okay? Here's an example. I'm an alumnus of Harvard Business School's Advanced Management Program. And so I get invited to these things in Washington. Long story short, the celebrity virus took hold of these guys, my colleagues from the alumni, and said, let's invite General Richard Myers, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under George W. Bush, to talk about his book. He's just written a book. It's Eyes on the Horizon. It's a 4-star Air Force general. Okay, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He got the memo. His name was right on it from Bush saying, we're not going to apply the Geneva Principles for prisoners of war. No. And we're going to treat them humanely as appropriate and as consistent with military necessity. So here I was at this. I went to this reunion. I said, so, General Myers, what did you say when the president said he was going to authorize torture? Oh, I didn't authorize. Look, General Myers, he says, there are the exceptions here. You know what that meant. He said, well, you talked around, And so, I said, look, you ought to be upfront with the American people, and particularly with people in uniform. I was in uniform. You were in uniform. How do you explain you're not standing up for the military principle of you don't abuse prisoners, you don't torture them, you don't interrogate them with enhanced interrogation techniques? Well, there was quite a... They were really very uncomfortable, the people, but they weren't uncomfortable with Joe Myers. They weren't comfortable with me asking these questions. And I lost some friends. Okay, as we went out, okay, one of my friends said, that was pretty ugly. That was very ugly. And it wasn't, okay? But I don't have the videotape to prove it. So, again, you need a video, okay? And then there was a Washington Post reporter there, okay? And he came up to me as we're going out, and he says, Mr. McGovern, you should be a journalist. And I looked at him and I said, you pretend to be a journalist? Oh, yeah. Let's see what you do with this story. Guess what he did with the story? 0, okay? So, again, be prepared. Read the book beforehand. One last thing I'll mention, it was James Clapper, who perjured himself before Congress a couple times. He wrote a book, too. And he was being hosted by William Burns, now head of the CIA, at the Carnegie Institute, of which Burns was then president. It's about 4 years ago, okay? So I get there a half hour early. I have to pay $30 for the book, okay? I go into the men's room. I go to the index. And what do I find? But James Clapper admits blithely that he lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He was head of imagery analysis. And what he writes is, and this is a quote, Dick Cheney was putting so much pressure on us to find weapons of mass destruction that we found things that weren't really there, period, end quote. My God, they found things that weren't really there. So I I had enough time to prepare my questions for you. You could see that all. Carnegie has it, but it's also on consortiumnews.com and other places. So my point is simply this. If there's a book being advertised, read it, or at least go to the index and find out a question that you want to ask these guys. Be prepared. Stay plugged in so people tell you about these things. Last thing, I don't belong to the Boy Scouts, but a good friend of mine is a big deal in the Boy Scouts. He tells me in August of last year, George W. Bush is coming to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I now live, to inspire the Eagle Scouts and the rest of the Boy Scouts in the area. Now, he didn't know that I would act on what he told me, but we acted real quick, okay? And we had billboards saying, war criminal coming to Raleigh, September 16th, big arena. Guess what? George W. Bush had to sneak in the back door. It was not announced in the local papers or the TV. He slithered out, and no one knew that he was in Raleigh. Well, that's better. That's better than people adoring him, as it often happens, or having him preach. So stay tuned. Make sure people tell you about these things, and then prepare yourself. And don't expect to be really popular with the crowd, but that's okay. They're going to drag you out. The police will, maybe not. We still have the Fourth Amendment. I mean, the First Amendment as the Fourth Amendment. As long as we have the First Amendment, it kind of will dissipate if we don't use it. So please use it. Follow the example of Jose Vega and the others. Use it. I'll end there. There are more current examples that you can bring forward. That's my pitch on what I learned from this and how I'm, very happy that while I was in Washington, I went to all these events, and when I could, I stood up and challenged people. When I knew that they were lying, I challenged them with the facts, if possible, if the facts that they had already lied about, as with Rumsfeld. I'll stop there. I'd be happy to answer your questions if you have some.
All right, Ray, there are some questions, and I also want to ask, before we go to the questions, because there's something very specific that's just happened in the past 24 hours, which we're going to have you respond to from Vladimir Putin. But Harley, if you're there and you have any comment you want to make on what Ray has just said, or otherwise on what you said earlier, go ahead.
Well, I think it's important that people see that what Ray's talking about is something that shouldn't be seen as a special act of valor, but it is because of the fear that's in the population. People say we're a great democracy, great free country. Then why are people afraid to speak out? And so what Ray has done and what he's talked about today and what Jose and Kynan and others have done is an example. And I remember, Dennis, 40 years or so ago, that's what you and I were doing when we were young people. And the whole point of this is that we have to get to a point where debate and discussion is not seen as an unnecessary provocation or confrontation, but where people who knowingly lie, and as I don't know if Ray heard my presentation, but I went through the lies behind this Summit for Democracy. When people are lying that blatantly, they can't be allowed to get away with it. And the problem is, around the rest of the world, people have figured out that US policy is based on lies and corruption. And many people in the United States have figured that also, but they're not acting on it. And so, Ray, I salute you for your service, for your commitment to this fight. And I hope people will see what you discussed today as an example for how all Americans should behave in the face of this unbelievable corruption and horror that has taken over our country.
So I want to pose something to you guys. This is March 31st. Yesterday, President Vladimir Putin released the comprehensive document called The Concept of the Foreign Policy of the Russian Federation. It consists of about 72 points, some of which have as many as 10 divisions. It opens by saying this concept is a strategic planning document which provides a systemic vision of the national interests of the Russian Federation in the domain of foreign policy. There's one of the articles in it, Article 14. I want to read to both of you and get your responses to it. Ray, we'll start with you from the first response, and so I'll just read it as it says. This is a quote. Article 14. In response to unfriendly actions of the West, Russia intends to defend its right to existence and freedom of development using all means available. The Russian Federation will concentrate its creative energy on the geographic vectors of its foreign policy, which have obvious prospects in terms of expanding mutually beneficial international cooperation. The majority of humanity is interested in having constructive relationships with Russia and in strengthening Russia's positions on the international scene as an influential global power, making a decisive contribution to maintaining global security and ensuring peaceful development of states. This opens up a wide range of opportunities for the successful activity of the Russian Federation on the international scene, unquote. Now, there are other very interesting things in different sections, but just wanted, Ray, I know you probably haven't had a chance to take a look at this document. It's a long document and it came out just yesterday. But any response you have to hearing this passage, is it representing sort of a change from your standpoint, or is it, in any case, what's your response to it?
Well, Dennis, the first thing I'll say, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're very clear.
Okay. First thing I'd say is that I fully expect Beijing to replay this statement and to agree with it and to applaud it. And there we are today, 2 against 1. Okay. The next thing I'd say is that when Putin talks about the very existence of Russia, he's not fooling around. Okay. Putting advanced missiles on the periphery of Russia. Already these holes exist in Romania and Poland. They probably won't be put into Ukraine anytime soon, but those are an existential threat of the same breed that existed with John F. Kennedy when Khrushchev tried to put the same kind of missiles in Cuba, just minutes away from the capital in Washington and the strategic air base in Omaha, Nebraska. Okay, just minutes. Now, we know how JFK reacted to that. We know that he actually violated the law in imposing a blockade. He called it a quarantine, but it was a blockade. In preparing an invasion force in Key West, and threatening nuclear war. You're not supposed to do that, okay? So did anyone back in 1962 say, hey, Mr. President, you are overreacting? This is not an existential threat. This is not a provocation. This is unprovoked. Of course not, because it was provoked. Now, if you look at starting the promise when we said we would not add to NATO anything 1 inch east of Germany at the time, well, now there are 31. Then there were 13. Okay, do the math. Okay, that was where it started. And more recently, of course, with the coup in Kiev, it became an immediate danger to Russia, the more so when it saw these holes, these capsules going into Romania and Poland. So, existential threat to Putin? Yes. What does that mean? What he says in the next sentence. He's going to use all necessary means to rebuff this threat. Now, the last thing I'll say here, is this an existential threat to the United States? No way. Now, you don't have to believe McGovern. President Barack Obama said precisely that about 6 years ago, or longer than that ago, to this guy Goldberg, who became his unofficial biographer. He said, we have to be careful not to overextend ourselves. Ukraine is in Russia's arc, and we don't want to extend ourselves more than we need to. I don't know why Biden forgot about that. Maybe he's not completely compass mentis, but Obama himself said pretty much what I just said. So there's an existential threat here. What's the last thing? Yeah, well, he talked about geography, didn't he? Now, this is the new element. When they started, by virtue of the numbers of forces they committed, the Russians just wanted to make sure they took the Donbass back. So Russian-speaking people would not any longer be killed. 14,000 had been killed up to then, now 5,000 more. By whom? By artillery coming from the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, where does geography come in? Well, with these longer range missiles and threats of aircraft and tanks and everything else, both Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Putin have said explicitly, now it's a matter of geography. We're going to go as far north and as far west as we have to. If you put in missiles that reach 100 miles, that just means we're going to have to push our front line 100 miles farther west. So that's the geography part of this thing. It's a very serious situation. And if I haven't already said it, there is such a time as too late. There is no trust. There is no communication. It's a worse situation that I've seen with respect to Russia and the U.S., and I've been watching this closely for 6 decades. Count them, 60 years.
Harley, you have anything?
Yeah, I'll just make one additional point. I think what Ray said about the military threat and Putin's reaction to it is very clear and straightforward. And Putin was very clear and straightforward in what he said. But that's all we're hearing about in the US media. But there's a whole other aspect to Putin's statement, which is the commitment to economic development in that whole, in the region of the neighborhood. And the idea that the Russian-China alliance was not initially primarily a military alliance, but was an economic one. And we're seeing that expand as the situation in the Western economies are collapsing. We're seeing banks go under, physical economy collapsing. We're seeing a renaissance in trade and investment. And part of what the Russians are defending is the right of nations to sovereign economic development. And that's part of this existential threat, that it's not simply the military deployment, but the attempt to squeeze nations and force them to adhere to the so-called rules-based order, which is an order designed to protect the collapsing Western banking system.
And we have some additional, there may be one additional poster we're going to post here. We're trying to get it up. And this was, Ray, from the president of Belarus. And that is Lukashenko. Right. Okay, we have it. And this was, again, yesterday. And he had the following to say: through the efforts of the United States and its satellites, a full-scale war has been unleashed in a neighboring country to the last Ukrainian. World War III with nuclear fire is looming on the horizon. It is impossible to defeat a nuclear power if the Russian leadership understands that the situation threatens Russia's disintegration. It will use the most terrible weapon. This cannot be allowed to happen, especially since the Ukrainians think they will win. This is nonsense. It is impossible to defeat a nuclear power. Both sides understand that it is impossible to achieve victory. So then it reports that the president called on both sides to start negotiations. Now, given that there's going to already be a well, okay, we'll continue with just leave that there for a minute. But there's already the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus, which should just be noted. So apparently, Lukashenko also raised the possibility of strategic nuclear weapons being placed on Belarus territory. Putin and I will decide and introduce here, if necessary, strategic weapons. And they must understand this, the scoundrels abroad who today are trying to blow us up from inside and outside. We will protect our sovereignty and independence by any means necessary, including through the nuclear arsenal. Don't say we will just be looking after them and these are not our weapons. These are our weapons, and they will contribute to ensuring sovereignty and independence. Now, it's unlikely that that statement is being made without consultation with Russia. Don't think that Lukashenko would do that. So, Ray, since you're the expert on these matters, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think you're right that it's impossible that Lukashenko would be going off talking on his own without getting a complete blessing from Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So, what do we have here? We have Xi Jinping of China. We have Lukashenko. We have Putin standing next to Xi Jinping when he calls for a ceasefire and talks. Okay. The way I read what Lukashenko said yesterday is, okay, West, this is your last chance. Listen up. Nuclear powers cannot be defeated. We don't know where you missed that lesson, but nobody tried to defeat a nuclear power for the last since Hiroshima. Okay, U.S. and the Soviet Union were very careful not to push each other this way. Now it's different. There's an existential threat. Okay, now we're gonna go on record, says Lukashenko, appealing for immediate ceasefire and talks, and we're going to join our allies, virtual allies, Russia and China, in appealing for this one last time. Okay. Now, if you don't listen, if you don't tell that twerp in Kiev, that what's his name, Zelensky, if you don't tell him to cease and desist, we are going to move our forces all the way west until the Dnieper River, and then we'll see if you're willing to talk. Because when that happens, there's a real question as to whether there will be a viable Ukraine country. Ukraine needs access to the Black Sea. If you want us to take Odessa, its port on the Black Sea that would remain, we'll take it. If there's a deal that can be cut there, and you'll keep your strategic as well as your tactical weapons geographically far enough west, there's a deal. So I see it as being extremely dangerous. They're going on record before the whole world saying, look, this is the situation. If you're not willing to talk, if there's no ceasefire now, we three major countries involved are going to have to do what we have to do, and we're willing to go the last mile and use nuclear weapons if we have to. I mean, last thing. After Putin won his last election, this is about 5 years ago, somebody came up to him and said, now, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you don't want to blow up the rest of the world, do you? So if there was a volley of nuclear weapons on its way to Russia, you would have to decide, would you retaliate and blow up the rest of the world too? Or how would you do? What would you do? And he looked at the reporter and he said, what would the world be without Russia? Now, that's not bravado. That shows what Putin is capable of doing, and I wager would do. The real problem is that these sophomores, these well-heeled, benighted Ivy League types that are running our policy for Joe Biden, don't understand that. That's why Putin, as recently as 3 months ago, called them crazy. Sumashedshi, out of mind shedshi, or walking out of your mind, okay? That's what he said. Why would America take on China as well as Russia at the same time? They must be crazy. And then he said it's probably explained by overweening arrogance and a feeling of impunity. I think he's right on that. I think that's why they proceed in this way, U.S. policymakers. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what Putin thinks and his military. And I'm convinced that they think that. They're not just saying it. His military has to prepare for the worst, and they're doing so. So let's hope that more enlightened leadership comes into our country, and that these well-heeled folks that are advising Biden kind of have a eureka moment and say, oh my God, look what we've done. We've driven China and Russia together. Do we really want to employ our armed forces on two fronts that far apart? Even the generals, even Milley, I think, would say, well, that's probably not a good idea. And it sure as hell isn't.
Harley, if you have a question, a comment, I'll take it. Otherwise, I have a question which I'll pose to both you and Ray.
Go ahead with the question.
Okay, it's from Thomas. He says, the newly elected president of the Philippines, Marcos Jr., is dedicated to development and security of the Philippines. So should he not take action to demilitarize his country from Anglo-American influence, because this will also be a major shift in the region away from the containment of China in the South China Sea? That was what he says. Please correct me if I am wrong about this. Yes. So Harley, why don't we start with you if you have a view of that?
Well, essentially, it appears that something interesting is happening in the Philippines with the pressure that's being put on him, probably from the U.S., with this whole idea of the global NATO extended into the Pacific. Because when he ran for president, he talked about the importance of the relationship with China and that he was going to continue to have trade and discussions with China. But recently he seemed to have the idea that they're building like 4 or 5 military bases, U.S. bases, expanding the bases there, that they're trying to incorporate it as a central feature in global NATO. It does appear as though there's a shift going on there. But look, there's a lot of fluidity to the situation as a whole in Asia right now. The ASEAN nations just met, and the Indonesians talked about the importance of an alternative to the dollar system. We even had Australian officials going to China. There's obviously the former Prime Minister of Australia said the AUKUS policy is insane. China's not about to attack Australia. So there's a lot of, I think, rethinking that's got to go on in governments that are being pulled into the global NATO Pacific strategy, including Japan and South Korea. So, I'm not sure what caused the shift with President Marcos in the Philippines. I think if he sits back and reflects on what was done to his father, he'll realize that he's now consorting with the people who destroyed his father's government and nearly destroyed the Philippines. So hopefully that can change.
On this? Any thoughts on that question? Or should I go to the next?
No, I think Harley got it right on the nose.
Okay. There's a question from Airbus, and who just says, there's a saying that without power, change is not possible. What's the best way to take power? That's the question. I think that's a good one for you, Ray.
Yeah, I'd like to address that frontally. There was an incredibly good documentary just out. It played on PBS on Tuesday evening. It's called The Movement and the Madman. Okay. Now, I don't want to ruin it for you. A lot of my friends are shown in that movement, like Dan Ellsberg and others. But the idea is that back in 1979, it looked, or 1979, let's say, was when Nixon was in power. He was threatening to use maximum force to obliterate North Vietnam and to threaten nuclear war. Guess what happened? Young people, young people on campus, young people who knew which end was up, got together. Massive demonstrations, massive, okay? Long story short, they didn't know whether they had succeeded, but they did. They learned years later that Nixon backed off. He told his aides, I can't do this. I can't obliterate North Vietnam and threaten nuclear weapons if I have so little support. So, teaching points there. Young people get together informally, but there were thousands and thousands of them, okay? They knew what the stakes were. And they cooperated and they demonstrated up to kazoo, we used to say in the Bronx, okay? It worked, but they didn't know it worked. So you can't always expect to know about the effect you're having. And that's really important because a lot of people, especially Americans, say, well, I'm not going to do this because, people laugh at me or, what good will it do? Well, the good was done here. Nuclear war was prevented. And, the name of the film is The Movement and the Madman. It is available now. You can go online and find it. And it's only an hour and a half. And it has to do with people who are young, like people we hope are listening here today, and what they were able to do because of their dedication and because they knew what the stakes were. So please do look at that. And I forget what the question was, but that's partial answer. Did I miss the nub of the question, Dennis?
I don't think so. I mean, basically, he's saying, you can't make change without power. So how do you take power? That was the question.
Yeah.
And it is an essential question, however one thinks about the formulation of it. Harley, you have any comment on it?
I think the important thing is that there has to be some people speaking with conscience in the United States and reaching into the Congress where apparently no one has any conscience. The Congress is a mess, but it's a mess that reflects the state of mind of the American people and the effect of the media and so on. But most people don't trust the media. Most people don't like the Congress. The president's popularity ratings are very low. So the question then is, do you sit around and wait and see what's going to happen with Donald Trump? Or do you go out and build a movement the way Ray is talking about it, fighting for truth? Recruiting especially young people who have a whole life ahead of them. Do they want to live in a country where truth is inaccessible? Or do they want to ensure that there's an opportunity for them to live useful lives in defense of the tradition, the best tradition of the United States? So, the question of power, how do you take the Congress back? You have a movement, you have a fight. You go out and raise the issues that we're discussing. And it's really helpful that we're having these conferences where we're bringing people from around the world to have discussions. And it gives Americans an opportunity to see that throughout the world, there are people who like the idea of the American tradition, but don't like the policies being pursued by the American establishment and their British collaborators. So, that's where the power comes from. I'll just finish by saying, the truth is not something that everybody possesses. It's not an opinion, but there is a way of getting at the deeper truths that are identified in Helga Zepp LaRouche's fundamental principles as a philosophical inquiry, cultural, historical. And that's the way people have to approach these things. And what Ray is saying is really important. You don't snap your fingers and get a change. You have to be in it for the long haul. And the long haul is for your whole life.
There's a question from one of the organizers, Ray, to you. It's posed by Anastasia, but it's being posed because there's several people that are on listening that are considering doing what you did and what some of the others have done. She asks, Ray, what is it that drove you to gain the courage to do your first intervention? We have a lot of new people in the United States who are thinking about joining this process, but have to go through the wall of fire, so to speak, to do it.
Well, I would answer that by saying you have to hang around with the right people. Okay? The people I hung around with in Washington were the Catholic worker, people taking care of the poor, people protesting against nuclear weaponry. Right before the attack on Iraq, exactly on the 13th of February, was my first arrest. Okay? I think back very kindly on that arrest for the learnings that it taught me. Okay, there were 6 of us. It was freezing cold. We were kneeling on a sidewalk where you weren't allowed to kneel, you weren't allowed to stay, you had to move. Okay, this is before the White House. We're put in a paddy wagon. I was glad to be in a paddy wagon because it was warm in there. Okay, they took us to the jail. Okay, now what happened at the jail? Well, it was just a really enlivening ceremony. Like, ceremony? Yeah, right. I had brought a loaf of bread, right? The next cell, the women, 6 women, 6 men, we shared bread. We did a sacramental kind of performance here. We said, we're one bread, we're one body, we're going to protest against this injustice, and whatever happens, we're ready to deal with it. Next thing I hear is, McGovern. I said, oh, okay. So this young guy, about 23, comes. He's got a uniform on. He says, all right, sit down. So I sit down. He says, all right, now, what's your name? I said, Ray McGovern. He said, okay, color hair. I said, brown. He looks at me and he says, don't put me on, McGovern. That's not brown. I said, well, yeah, sure, it's brown. I always say it's brown. No, it's not brown. It's white. So go in the men's room and take a look. I go to the men's room and say, oh, damn, he's right. It's white. I was like, come back. I said, it's gray. He says, no, it's white. I'm putting, see the thing? It says WH, that's white. I'm putting that in. Now, let me just explain. The reason I say that, it's the worst thing that happened to me the whole day and in captivity was realizing I hear them burn anymore, okay? What were the lessons? When they brought us into court, they sat us in this cavernous hearing room with all kinds of people around. We're around this desk or this big table, and the judge talks to the police officer. Guess what? The arresting officer has not come to testify. So, judge says, Catholic worker group, dismissed. We have to have the arresting officer. So I'm just about out the door when Art Laffin, pretty big Catholic worker, says, no, Ray, he says, Your Honor, can I say a couple words as to why we were doing this? And then for the next 5 minutes, with rapt silence around the room, he explained exactly why we were doing it on that particular day, which was the anniversary of a so-called smart bomb landing in a shelter where 400 plus women and children were killed in Baghdad. Okay? That was a couple of years before. So, last thing is, I'm out the door then we have coffee. And they say, now, Ray, what just happened? And I told them, no, you don't realize what happened. Why didn't the arresting officer show up? I said, well, you remember how she listened to us? Remember how she was very sympathetic? Remember how she loosened your handcuffs because of your wrist? Yeah. She didn't want to be part of having her son or her uncle or nephew or anybody like that sent off to this god-awful war. And so she did a very gutsy thing. You don't fail to show up at these things. She failed to show up. A little evidence or big evidence of fortitude and courage under fire. So what did I learn? I learned from that people take notice of what you're doing, and that the Catholic worker are used to being sort of arrested and arraigned, and never put in prison very much, except when they knock on nuclear warheads and things like that. So I said to myself, well, if they can do that, and I just will finish with this. As I sat there in Atlanta, knowing I had the goods on Rumsfeld, I'm having this conversation. Should I should I? These guys don't look very cordial here. Should I? I mean, then I McGovern, Medician, and Wright. They wouldn't be this. And they give me their reverends challenging this. What kind of a wuss are you? So hang around, okay? Take their example to heart. Encourage them. Be edified by them, and you'll find it easier to do the right thing when it presents itself.
Okay, Ray, let me just let you know we were having a little bit of a problem again with your connection. It's distorted slightly, a little jumpy. Just know that. I don't know if there's anything we can do to work on that.
Okay.
But just be
I
aware.
do think I'm going to have to go back. I think my wife, as you know, is in the ER. I'm going to go back in there now. Thanks very much for letting me go on as you did. And hey, young people, adelante, okay? There are enough of us. Cesar Chavez used to always say, hey, I got an idea. Let's have a boycott of grapes. Yeah, that'd be good. And everybody around him would say, no, Cesar, there aren't enough of us. There aren't enough of us. And Cesar would say, hey, there are enough of us, but without action, nothing's going to happen. The boycott of grapes happened, and it was a huge success. Let's start with little grapes, but let's do action. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. And we'll let you know what kind of responses we got from people who are here and in discussion. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks.
Harley,
most welcome.
Okay, great. Harley, I'm going to pose to you the next question. And this is a question which comes from one of the organizers from the Rage Against the Machine rally. But he's asking this question about why, I'm sorry, I lost it here. How much of the warmongering and naive good versus evil mindset that we're seeing so much of is an outgrowth of either the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Zionism. So I think we could invert the question also and just say we're asking a question about that conflict. Obviously, there's also something very specific going on in Israel right now about which people are very agitated, involving Netanyahu and the judicial reforms. So there's something specific about that. But then he's asking a broader question. So that's it.
Well, I'm not sure I fully get the broader question unless he's talking about the power in the United States of a pro-Israel lobby. But I think the broader point here is that what we're seeing happen in Israel right now is indicative of a storm which is sweeping the world. Governments that are moving supposedly in the name of democracy and freedom, but are arrogant in their attempt to suppress opposition. It's not the autocracies, the so-called authoritarian governments that are doing it. It's the governments in the West. Look at the French situation. Macron intervened to assert an emergency decree to stop a vote, which he was afraid he might lose on the pension reform. As a result, every day now for the last 10 days, there have been millions of people in the streets of France. In Israel, when Netanyahu decided that he was going to do away with the power of the judiciary to override the essentially unipolar order of his extremist grouping through their control of the Knesset and the presidency, the prime ministership, that when he took that, the people who were most visible in the streets, besides the average citizen, were the reservists, the army reservists, who caused Netanyahu to fire the defense minister and to start talking about civil war. And this at a time when the Israelis are thinking seriously about the possibility of launching more strikes against Iran. So I think the point on the Israeli question in regards to the bigger issue is that governments that act out of arrogance against the interests of their population are the ones that will eventually be hopefully overthrown, defeated, and whether hopefully through civil disobedience, but peaceful demonstrations. So, we're seeing a situation where power and money and control of media doesn't always work. And this is I think, to just add to what Ray was saying, if you're a person who has an idealistic view of the world, a love of humanity, a sense of the beauty of the other, and the legitimate rights of other people, eventually this will become the basis for a winning fight. And I think in terms of Israel, the one thing that's not really being talked about in terms of the situation there is that while this is occurring over a move against the judiciary, the Israelis are continuing an escalation against the Palestinian people. And this is something which is going to become a bigger issue, especially if the trend of the recent period of a growing sense of brotherhood among the Arab and Muslim governments in the area, the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, President Assad's visit to the United Arab Emirates, the role of Turkey and Egypt as other Muslim governments that are involved in the discussion process, that the Palestinian issue must be dealt with and will be dealt with, because the rest of the world is not going to tolerate what we've tolerated for the last years in Israel. And the fact that Netanyahu has put in an extreme government to carry out the Greater Israel policy and the suppression of not just the Palestinian rights, but now the rights of average Israelis. I think this is a very interesting moment and an opportunity for real change.
Okay, there's two questions concerning the Trump arrest, or rather the indictment and so on. One is from Bernie Holland, and it is the case that they want Trump jailed because if he became president, he would neutralize what Ray calls the Mickey Mat. That's one question. And then the second question, which was from Crystal, I believe, was, is this a real fight or is this just a drama? Is this something that is really more of a diversion than a real fight?
Well, both of them touch on a deeper issue, which is that what Trump represented in the 2016 campaign and in his initial statements when he became president was what seemed to be an insurgency against the secret government that had jailed Lyndon LaRouche and that had been under Bush and Obama, an immoral, oppressive regime, and that was carrying out permanent wars. It was committed to permanent war. It was committed to bailouts of the banks and the collapse of the physical economy, the green policy, and so on. So everyone who voted for Trump had a certain expectation, which wasn't realized. Now, there are many reasons for that, and I don't want to go into them. But clearly, the fact that he wasn't completely under control and he did fight back is part of the impulse to go after him. Now, on the other side, there are people who are saying that the attempt to put him in jail on such a really petty charge, I mean, the idea that this was a felonious violation of law and that Trump should go to jail for hush money, I mean, that's clearly something which is a provocation. Now, some people are saying that the people behind it are trying to get Trump elected. I think the important thing here is that the U.S. political system is collapsing, because the ability to address the real problems, the problems of war and peace, the problem of economic development, the problems of fake science, as we see with the green policy, these are the real issues. And instead, the media loves the kind of psychodrama that can play out around the arrest of a former president. And of course, you throw in the question of, did he or did he not have an affair? That plays into the perversion of the entertainment society. So in a sense, it is a diversion from the real issues, but it does provide an opportunity to get at the question of what has the last 8 years taught us about the United States, which is more and more people now realize that the real decisions are not being made in the open. There's no transparency, that there's an establishment which is pulling strings on left and right, Democrat, Republican, and more people are coming to realize that. So rather than get caught in the trap of being in the crosshairs of polarization and the profiles of identity politics, look at the bigger picture. We have a task to do. We have to bring down this neoliberal system and the permanent war machine of the neocons and the military-industrial complex. And we have to stay focused on that no matter what the media does.
One last question, which is what relates to the opening of the program and what Lynn had to say about economics. And this is a question concerning where are we now in the banking crisis and debacle. We last heard about Deutsche Bank. There had been, of course, SVB Bank, Credit Suisse, and so on. And is it the case that the recent discussions around Glass-Steagall look like they're going to go anywhere, whether that be in the United States or in other nations?
Well, interestingly, a bill was introduced for Glass-Steagall banking separation, or will be introduced in the Italian parliament. And there's discussion in Handelsblatt, the German business daily, some discussion going on in the United States, the possibility of I believe, a bill being reintroduced, the Glass-Steagall revival coming from Marcy Kaptur of Ohio. So the Glass-Steagall issue is really back on the front burner. Now, the problem is that I think Paul Gallagher made the point last week that we're not really dealing with what is essentially a bank crisis, but a systemic economic collapse. And the banking side of it is important because the banks, especially the large private banks that control the central banks, are at the center of the policies that have destroyed the physical economy. But what we're dealing with is a collapse of the physical economy. And that's what speculation is. When money goes into bets on various financial instruments, many of which are backed by nothing, but there are two sides betting on it, like a sports bet. What backs up the currency? That's what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about. Money is not wealth. And this is where the brainwashing problem gets in. So when you start talking about bailouts of $200 billion in the case of the Credit Suisse, or the $30 billion for First Republic, people's heads spin. They start thinking, does this mean I have to pull my money out of the bank? People start getting focused on personal survival. The issue here is that we've been going in the wrong direction since 1971, as Lyndon LaRouche pointed out, before Nixon moved to end the Bretton Woods system and end the gold reserve system for the dollar. We've been going in the wrong direction, and we've increasingly gone through tranches of collapse. Now we have an opportunity to use this not to address a so-called banking crisis, but the fundamental crisis in the thinking of the population about real economics versus money. And so, I think where we stand right now, Deutsche Bank, Scholz, the chancellor in Germany, said Deutsche Bank is not going to be allowed to fail. The Swiss moved in and wouldn't let Credit Suisse go down. They tried to protect the integrity, so-called integrity of the banking system with Credit Suisse. We're seeing Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell making these crazy statements about the security and stability of the banking system, even as Moody's, the credit agency, lowered the rank from stability, or the rating from stability to negative for the US banking system. But again, it's not primarily a banking crisis, it's a crisis in the thinking, which has shifted the economy of the United States from a credit system for physical production, for science and technology, into a creation of a flood of money that can be used to back up indebted corporations, indebted local governments, and indebted banks that can never cover the face value of the assets they're holding, and needs the liquidity, but the liquidity doesn't address the problem of insolvency. That's where you get to what LaRouche was talking about, physical production. So I think we can use this, as Ray always talks, as a learning experience, but it's got to be learning quickly, because the other thing that's emerging, and this is something Americans need to know, and people in Western Europe need to know, there's a new financial system which is largely oriented around the principles that Lyndon LaRouche discussed in that short segment we showed at the beginning, of physical investment in physical production, in increasing the efficiency of energy and the productivity of labor. That's what we see with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Plus, the Eurasian Economic Forum, the African Union, the attempt to revive Mercosur in South America. All of these are looking in the post-dollar era, de-dollarization. And we see it also in terms of the West Asia, the rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians, the potential to use the resources, the monetary resources of the oil-producing countries to invest in physical economy and move to away from the dollar funny money currency system. So this is a great moment of opportunity, and instead of being panicked about a banking crisis, we ought to take this opportunity to get back to the full discussion of what the American system of physical economy is about, and why it is that what we're seeing from China, Russia, India, and a number of other countries is something which Americans not only could support, but would benefit from. That what's essential is for the United States to become part of this new system, instead of opposing it the way we see reflexively the British and the American governments reacting against it.
We have a comment from the chat that's going on. This comes in from one of our organizers, from Tom Simpson, who reminds people of this. He says, a person may not know the level of courage he or she can muster until the first time they go through the ring of fire of intervening themselves. Speaking as someone who was involved in intervening on Henry Kissinger and George H.W. Bush and his chief of staff, James Baker III, at Rice University, my advice to anyone considering doing something along these lines is that you get better at it with each intervention. So the advice is just go ahead and do it, basically. There are actually now a couple of other questions. I'm going to pose them to you, and then we'll go to our conclusion. One is from Ari. He's saying, great to hear about the distinction of economics based on debt versus real resources. If I understood right, will the EU accept the resources-based economy thinking? Is that possible? That's one question. And then the second question, which I'll pose at the same time, it's slightly different, is about the ICC warrant on Putin. Is the ICC warrant on Putin a distraction similar to what's being done with Trump? So those are your
Let me take the second one first. I mean, the ICC indictment of Putin is laughable. What's he charged with? Rescuing Ukrainian children who were in a war zone, who couldn't be protected by the Ukrainian government because they're losing their soldiers at a rapid pace and they're engaged in a war. So Putin pulled out, according to Russian sources, 1,400 children according to some Ukrainians, they're saying 200 to 300,000. And the Russians said, can you give us the names of these people? But the ICC is an obviously corrupt institution. Its association with George Soros alone should be enough to tell people that it is corrupt. As Ray pointed out, the ICC never investigated war crimes committed by the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan, despite the Assange documents released by WikiLeaks of U.S. atrocities in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the Russians are looking at this as another example of the hypocrisy of the West. And keep in mind, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court because of the fear that there might be indictments against U.S. officials for U.S. war crimes. So rather than a diversion, it's an attempt to rally support for the heroic Ukrainians up against the vicious Russians and the murderous Putin. And I think much of the world looks at this as an example, again, of the hypocrisy of the West. Now, on the European Union, look, the European Union is in turn an internal wreck right now. I mentioned earlier the situation in France. The pension reform is really the central topic, but the bigger issue is destruction of agriculture, destruction of energy production in France, destruction of industry. In Germany, even before the Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged likely by Biden and the United States, Germany was facing a severe energy crisis. In 15 days, the last 3 working nuclear plants in Germany are about to be shut down. How are they going to replace the loss of electricity from those plants? Wind and solar don't cut it. So the idea that somehow the Europeans have a solution to protect the economy, and of course Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the European Central Bank, former director of the International Monetary Fund, she has no clue. She has no plan. Their plan is the same as Jerome Powell. Massive bailouts, unlimited bailouts to protect a collapsed banking system. Now, the question, and of course then you can look at the United Kingdom and just see what a mess that place is. So you look around Europe and you ask yourself, where are the sensible people? Why is Europe committing massive resources or significant resources to a losing effort in Ukraine on behalf of the United States and the United Kingdom to destabilize Russia? So you see the problem, the same thing we were talking about earlier, the lack of political leadership with vision and the lack of opposition with the strength and courage to take that on. Now, that's what we're building. We're talking to people all over Europe, all over the global south, and in the United States, who have an understanding that we can't continue in this way because this path is leading us to nuclear war. And if we can somehow avoid a nuclear war, it's leading us to massive depopulation because of the destruction of the agricultural sector and the destruction of the ability to trade and invest. So, is there an alternative inside Europe? Well, we're going to have to see. I think the one hope is that virtually every coalition government in Europe is now reaching minority status. The support for the Social Democrats in Germany is collapsing. The Free Democrats are collapsing. The Greens in Germany are staying down a little bit, but they're staying up because you have a whole lot of people in Germany who are wealthy believers in the green ideology. But nevertheless, the 3 parties together in opinion polls are significantly below 50%. Macron, in his election, in the first round, was at about 26%. And right now he's down in the polls about to the Joe Biden level. So, the current existing political establishment is on the run. In Holland, the ruling party, which is behind the green agricultural policies that are driving farmers into the streets, they lost significantly in most recent elections. So there's a potential for new alliances to emerge. We saw that with the 50,000 person demonstration at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, where, similar to the rage against the war machine in the United States, the leaders said that we're not interested in left or right, we're interested in peace and development. So, I think that message has to get out. And if it does, the attempts of the unelected bureaucrats running the European Union and the European Commission, they're going to fall on their faces. So, again, the potential is there for change. And that's why I would encourage people to sign up, register for our conference April 15th and 16th. We're in a moment of history, a strategic conjuncture that's unprecedented in my lifetime, my political lifetime, which goes back to 1970, 71. And it's an opportunity for people to shape the future based on real principles of natural law and science. And so, will Ursula von der Leyen and the racist Borrell from the European Commission, are they going to be able to come up with an alternative policy? I think the answer is probably no, but there are people who are better capable of addressing this and can look at the world and see the shift that's underway. And hopefully we can pull together coalitions in Western Europe and in the United States to shift from this present sinking ship, get off the sinking ship, and get back to fundamental principles of physical economy.
I'm going to make an exception, Harley, with respect to one additional question, and because of the fact that every time we have one of the upcoming Schiller conferences, and there was a discussion about this earlier today, actually, the issue is, what are people supposed to do? Are they just attending this thing? Because they're online, after all. Generally, they've been online. There have been some hybrid conferences, but generally we've been doing conferences online. And what we need, and what is needed by the world, is thousands of people to actually be doing the kind of thing that Ray McGovern talked about. And also, in addition to that, to deliberate on and actually just read and discuss things like the 10 Principles for a New Security and Development Architecture that Helga LaRouche has written. So this next question, I think we can use in the following way. The issue of the conferences is that conferences do something that does not occur anywhere else on the planet. That people, whether it be Ray McGovern, or it be people who are economists or former heads of state, or sometimes official representatives of various governments, come onto that platform and they get a chance to talk to people who are completely not them. They don't come from the diplomatic community. They don't come from the farm sector. They don't come from the labor sector. But all these people come and they converge on our platform. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with Lyndon LaRouche, the personality, and the accomplishments, the intellectual accomplishments and achievements of Lyndon LaRouche, especially in the field of physical economy. And the organizing that Lyndon LaRouche demanded. It was a very specific thing he requested that we do. And that was to organize what was called united fronts. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in my own conclusion, but I'll just say the following. The notion was, whoever you were, that what you had to do was to organize with people who were completely different than you, recognizing that there was a single unity of purpose and intent. And that this could be even defined from the standpoint of physical economic program and policy, which we often did, as national policy and international policy. So this next question, which came from the chat, was asking, can Harley give a quick overview of the LaRouche influence on the BRI of China, and whether the success of China is due to its shift from Marxist to Hamilton/List ideas? I would add something a little bit different. I think Harley knows what I'm getting at, which is, what is the role right now of the conference that we're about to do, and we have 2 weeks to organize it, in creating concrete shifts in policy among nations, groups of nations, which would have the effect of causing similar paradigm shifts, whether it be of the type that was indicated in this question or be the type that has to happen in America, where you need a complete 180-degree reversal from what is expressed as policy, and that may have to come right out of the streets of America if it can't come out of the Congress of the United States or out of the State Department or out of the judiciary. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about the people who are listening or the people who would attend such a conference. So again, Harley, I'll just repeat that. It was, can Harley give a quick overview of the LaRouche influence on the BRI of China, and whether the success of China is due to its shift from Marxist to Hamilton list ideas?
Well, that's a complicated question, and it probably would be best posed to Helga, but let me give a couple of hints. The adoption of the BRI, which is Belt and Road Initiative, in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and making that the policy of China, came a decade and a half after it was the concept of the New Silk Road was introduced by Lin and Helga. And they had been attending conferences, meeting with leaders around the world, engaging in discussions to promote this idea, the idea of corridors of development, of connecting technology centers and research and development, and most importantly, a credit policy to make sure that these kinds of changes could take place. Now, they were pretty much alone in presenting that over the years. And we saw after 2013 something from China, which was the adoption of something that is minimally parallel or echoes the ideas that were presented by Lin and Helga. Now, I don't know the details of the relationship of people around Xi Jinping to what the LaRouches were doing, but it's clear that Helga is being brought in very significantly into discussion process in China, but also throughout the developing sector, and now increasingly in Europe and the United States. So the idea that was introduced has caught on. And our job is not to try and figure out who in China is a Hamiltonian or a reformed Marxist or whatever, but to continue to fight for these ideas and fight for the conception behind them. There was Lyndon LaRouche's idea of physical economy. Now, in terms of Russia, I can say that the prominent economist Sergei Glaziev issued a statement on the anniversary of Lynn's death this year, in which he identified Lyndon LaRouche as the most important economist, and I may have the wording wrong, but one of the most important economists in the world in the last quarter century. And we know that there's discussion of Lynn's ideas, and including discussion with Helga and other leaders from our organization all over the world. So once an idea is out there, it can take on a life of its own, and we see that it is, because if the idea is valid and can stand up to criticism, then you can win people over. Now, this gets to the question of what are these conferences about? We're hashing out different approaches to how do you solve the problem of war and depression, of the evil of the globalist forces who are behind the wars, who are behind the regime change, behind the IMF conditionalities policy, the neo-colonial attacks on the developing sector, identifying who they are and what their policies are, but then having discussions on how to get out of that existing unipolar order into a new era, which is not multipolar because that's still divided, but which operates on the basis of human reason, on higher principles of natural law. And that's what these conferences are about, to engage as many people as possible in that discussion. And in some cases, due to, in a sense, it's both the problem as well as the opportunity that you have from internet, that instead of having people all in one room, we can have people all over the world involved in these discussions. And that's what we'd like. And people can participate through the chat room, but also through putting their questions into the panelists And then after listening to the discussions, bringing your friends in, bringing your neighbors in, your coworkers, your people at your church or religious grouping. So what we're involved in, and it, as the question implies, it has been successful, is bringing an idea of Hamiltonian credit, of physical economy back into the discussion. Glass-Steagall, nuclear fusion. These are things which had been written off as, when LaRouche talked about going to Mars, they said he's a nut. When you talk about Glass-Steagall, oh, that's from the FDR period, that's been discredited. People who tried to bury these ideas are finding that because of the crisis, that the prescience of Lyndon LaRouche has kept these ideas alive, and now there's a possibility for them to grow. So that's what the conference is about. And I think if people have been part of this conference, have attended some of them, have listened to them, and by the way, the last conferences are all available on archive on the website. You can go and listen to them and judge for yourself. But I think these are not just educational, they're agitational, they're provocational. We're trying to provoke people to recognize that if you want to change, it's not good enough to gripe and moan and talk about how bad the bad guys are, but to become part of the solution. And that's what I'd encourage people to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Harley, for being with us here and for stepping in after a bit of kerfuffle there with Ray. Of course, we want to thank Ray McGovern, who was able to be with us for only a short period of time, but I think we're able to have him answer many of the questions and certainly have the discussion about intervention. Again, we're going to show the poster for the conference. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace for the planet. Citizens of the world unite. International Schiller Institute Conference. We're asking that people register. Please do that. We want early registrations. And one of the reasons we want the early registrations is that we want to have the people that register begin to organize other people, because that's the idea. The first thing that you can do to learn how to intervene is start organizing, try to organize anybody else. Don't get discouraged when you find that that's hard, because it's often hardest to organize the people that think that they know you the best. Any kind of change in paradigm that you're expecting to have in a general society, you've got to get that going with people that you yourself meet or know. And sometimes they're the hardest because they see you changing. And it implies a kind of change, which is now a personal change, rather than just complaining about some abstract authority, be that in Washington or be it in London or Paris or any other capital of a nation. So that's what the conference will be doing. So I just want to reference now in the closing of the show a document that Lyndon LaRouche wrote back in 1983 called Saudi Arabia in the Year 2023. And in that document, there's a passage that's the cover of the document. I believe it is actually available online. If people are interested, you can get in touch with our organizers and find out about it. And he said the following, pointed out the following. In 1766, Dr. Benjamin Franklin visited London to plead for reconciliation between the North American English colonies and Britain. His own experience in London and the advice of his friend, Dr. Joseph Priestley, convinced Franklin that the political institutions and morality of Britain had degenerated to such a low point that the two peoples could not continue to live under a common government. Franklin employed his world standing as a leading scientific worker to organize a vast conspiracy beginning that year. Franklin established directly networks in France, at Göttingen University in Germany, and in Sweden, and through connections with Italy, Spain, Russia, and elsewhere, including later, even the struggle for Greek independence. At the time of the American Revolution, Russia, which had progressed under the programs designed by Leibniz for Peter the Great, exceeded Britain in mining and manufacturing. The literacy of the people of the United States was over 90%, more than twice the 40% literacy rate in Britain. The average American produced twice as much and had twice the income of the average person in England. The inferiority of the British to the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and Russia in science continued into the 1840s. And we cite this because it will probably shock most people, certainly in the United States, to realize that the American Revolution was from the beginning an international conspiracy, something that involved Benjamin Franklin organizing several other nations. And that was, by the way, over a period of approximately 30 years in which he was actually involved in that kind of thing prior to the revolution. And then, of course, he spent most of his time in Paris during the period after the revolution actually was engaged in 1776, after he had returned from Paris, come back to America in Philadelphia. The the Declaration of Independence, Assembly of Congress, Continental Congress, deliberated on that document actually for several days and then declared it in a written form by July 4th of 1776. Now we are required to do something like that, had convened the same kind of gathering, but this will be people from all over the world. Well, it was in that sense also people from all over the world even then, if you include the Marquis de Lafayette from France, Kosciuszko and Casimir Pulaski from Poland, various persons from Italy, the support from Carlos III of Spain, von Steuben from Germany. There were people from all over. And importantly, it's important to note that while many people like to talk about how the African presence in America was merely that of enslaved people, and it's true that they were largely enslaved people, there were a lot of free African Americans in that sense who had, from the period of the 1620s, 1630s, been in America. By the time you got to the American Revolution, many of those people had gained their freedom because some of them had been indentured servants, some of them simply purchased their way out of slavery. They were also, and others who were enslaved, became partisans on the American side in the American cause, not merely on the British side. I only cite that because it's often falsified in reports of the American history. What we are looking at in our conference, in the conference that we're convening, is something that brings together certain qualities of many other conferences. There was the Treaty of Westphalia of 1644 to 48, and that was a conference intended to resolve the 30 Years' War, in which almost, a third of Europe had been killed in that conference. There was the Continental Congress of 1787-89 of the United States, in which the Constitution was actually assembled. There was the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. We talk about the Bretton Woods system and what that represented, which should be changed now and amplified because, of course, many of the countries that presently don't exist now did not exist then. And there's also the Nuremberg trials of 1946 through 49, not to be importantly not to be forgotten, because there is a need for accountability. We're not talking about the kind that the International Criminal Court talks about, but we are talking about the kind that should be discussed concerning what really happened with the Iraq War of 2003, or the invasion of Syria, or the invasion of Libya, and other such actual crimes against humanity that should in fact be discussed and debated at the United Nations. But we're talking about a conference process that has all of those elements, but they have to be wrapped into an actual policy for what would be the solution. And that is what we are going to be discussing at the conference. There are the documents that have been produced for that, particularly the 10 principles for a strategic architecture, principles of a new international security and development architecture, and also a call by Helga Zepp-LaRouche for an emergency conference to deal with the financial crisis. The call for an emergency international conference to reorganize the bankrupt financial system. So these are the prep documents that people should look at, should read, should discuss, and also should respond to. Maybe you don't agree with various of the things in those documents. Maybe there's something in those documents that you think should be amplified or changed. And as with the Declaration of Independence, the notion is that people are in a Congress, in an assembly, and they deliberate on these matters so that the way to solve problems which seem to be too great for an individual is to meet, to convene, and to have individuals from all over the world so that that can be the basis of an understanding for what has to be done to secure the rights and the needs of people from all over the world in a just and equitable way. So that's 2 weeks from today. It'll start at 9 a.m. in the morning. It'll go through Sunday afternoon and also be concluded by a concert, by the way, that will be given by members of the Schiller Institute, all again online. But you can also attend if you are in the New York City area where that will be happening. So we want to thank you all, and thank especially all the people that were asking questions. There were a lot of them, and there were others that we weren't unable to get to at the last minute. I want to thank Ray McGovern again emphatically for his being here. He was involved in a medical situation which required his attention, and there were some problems which we apologize for. But we think that his intent was clear, and we think that his advice was clear. And we hope that you'll follow his advice, get involved, and as he has often said, find out what you stand for, figure it out, and then wherever that it is, stand on that principle. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. See you next week.